Several years ago, my life ran like a well-oiled machine. I focused on improving the house, unwinding with a cold beer after work, and keeping my skills sharp on the hockey rink. My wife, Lauren, and I had a practical, steady life together. Of course, like any marriage, there were challenges, but I handled them without complaint. It started with minor things, a few missed calls and flimsy excuses when she was late coming home. I didn't think much of it at the time. But as her work trips increased and her demeanor grew colder, the pieces didn't add up. I trusted my gut, and it told me something was off, though I had no proof. Yet, the pivotal moment came one winter evening with a phone call that flipped my world upside down. Lauren had told me she'd be flying to Houston for work, and I had no reason to doubt her. While she was supposedly out of town, I stuck to my routine, indulging in a war movie marathon. I'd queued up Band of Brothers for the night, and was settled in when my phone buzzed. I assumed it was Greg, my closest friend, and answered casually. Instead, a woman's calm, professional voice greeted me. "This is Detective Morgan from Vale," she began. Her words carried a weight that immediately caught my attention. She told me my wife had been in a serious accident and was in the hospital in Eagle Valley. I was skeptical. "You must be mistaken. She's in Houston," I replied firmly. The detective's tone didn't waver. "When was the last time you saw her?" she asked. I hesitated but answered truthfully. "We spoke on the phone last night before her flight." She pressed on, citing Lauren's ID, which listed our home address. My irritation flared. "If someone stole her purse, I'll make sure they face charges," I shot back. The detective asked me to drive down and confirm the situation. Reluctantly, I agreed. The drive to Vale was uneventful, giving me too much time to think. A gnawing doubt crept in. What if she wasn't in Houston at all? The notion that Lauren might be lying wasn't easy to stomach, but I wasn't the kind of man to let emotions cloud my judgment. I had no tolerance for deceit, and if it turned out she betrayed me, I already knew my next move. She'd be out of my life for good. I wouldn't be a fool, and I certainly wouldn't let anyone make me one. I thought back to my father, who had crumbled under the weight of my mother's infidelity, turning into a bitter, paranoid shell of himself. Then there was my brother, Nathan, whose unrestrained anger had landed him in prison after he let betrayal drive him to irreversible actions. I wasn't about to follow either of their paths. If Lauren crossed a line, I'd handle it cleanly and decisively, without letting it destroy me. When I finally arrived, the sharp winter air bit at my face as I strode into the hospital. I approached the information desk and made my purpose clear. A nurse directed me to the ICU, where I met another nurse, a short blonde with a professional demeanor and a surprisingly sharp gaze. "Your wife is sedated," she informed me, her voice measured but sympathetic. "She's badly injured, and she may not look like herself. I wanted to warn you, so you can be prepared." I didn't flinch. "Let me see her," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. When I stepped into the room, I stopped in my tracks. The woman lying in the bed was battered beyond recognition. Though her height and build matched Lauren's, her swollen and bruised face made it impossible to be certain. I stared at her for a long moment, my mind racing as I took in the scene. "She hit every tree on the mountain?" I asked dryly, eyeing the nurse. The nurse shook her head. "No, sir. She wasn't skiing. Someone knocked her unconscious and left her in an ambulance outside this morning." Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. Faithful wives don't end up unconscious and abandoned in strange places, I thought. My inner voice agreed, but I needed facts, not speculation. "I'm not convinced this is my wife," I told the nurse flatly. "Maybe this will help," she said, lifting the blanket to reveal the woman's left thigh. There it was, the unmistakable tattoo of Jiminy Cricket, a mark I'd seen countless times. She got it before our wedding, claiming it symbolized her parents, Jim and Ian. I never really believed that story, but the tattoo was proof enough. It was Lauren. I stared at her motionless body, taking in her injuries. This wasn't the first time I'd seen her in such a state. My mind flashed back to the night we met. It was after a Tool concert. My friends and I were celebrating with a case of beer in our van when a girl walked up, asking for a drink for her boyfriend. Chad, always the loudmouth, smirked and said, You can stay and have a drink, but your boyfriend's out of luck." She left, but moments later, screams echoed from the parking lot. I ran toward the commotion and saw her being attacked by a short, wiry guy yelling, "Where's my beer, you witch?" He swung at her, striking her repeatedly while onlookers did nothing. Without hesitation, I grabbed him by the collar and yanked him away. He turned to me, his face twisted with anger, and tried to take another swing at her. I didn't give him the chance. One punch, and he was out cold. I helped her back to the van, where Chad handed me an ice pack. Security arrived and hauled the guy away, but I wanted to report him. She stopped me. "You've done enough," she said softly. "No one's ever stood up to Garrett. He'll probably go back to Wyoming now." Despite her bruises, she was beautiful in a gothic sort of way. We drove her home that night, and Chad, ever observant, leaned over and whispered, "She's into you." I brushed it off, but she left a note with her number. "Call me, Lauren." 2 days later, I called. She was surprised but genuinely happy to hear from me. We talked for hours, and she called me again that evening. By Friday, we were on our first date, an Italian restaurant followed by drinks and dancing. When I dropped her off that night, she asked bluntly, "Are you trying to get me into bed?" I smirked. "There's plenty of time for that later. I like to wait. It makes things more interesting." I kissed her cheek and left. 3 weeks passed before we saw each other again, but the connection remained strong. When we finally had another free weekend, her aunt passed away, delaying our plans. The weekend after her return, we went to the movies, where I met her father, Jim. He seemed polite at first, asking about my job and background. Then he muttered something about her ex being a loser and how I was a better fit. The next time we went out, things escalated. On our way home, she had sudden stomach cramps, so I brought her to my apartment. After she used the restroom, she emerged in nothing but red lingerie and heels. "Take off your coat," she said. Needless to say, I took off more than that. Back at the hospital, the nurse handed me Lauren's belongings in a plastic bag. "The police have already gone through these," she explained. As I glanced at the items, her phone rang. After a brief conversation, she passed it to me. "This is Detective Morgan," the voice on the other end said. "We need you to come to the station for questioning." I agreed, already piecing together what I'd say. Something didn't sit right, and I wasn't about to leave any stone unturned. The police suspected me of hurting Lauren. The idea was as ridiculous as it was insulting. Why would I harm her? Because she betrayed me? Maybe. But without proof of her infidelity, all I had were suspicions, especially with her showing up in Vail instead of Houston. I tried to think logically. Maybe she'd won some last-minute trip, flown to Denver, rented a car, and gotten into trouble. It all sounded absurd, but none of it added up yet. By the time I arrived at the station, the sun was setting behind the mountains. A brunette introduced herself as Detective Desiree Phillips. Flanked by a tall, broad-shouldered man she introduced as Deputy Devin. Phillips seemed friendly enough, but Devin stared at me like he'd already decided I was guilty of something. "Do I need a lawyer?" I asked, looking him square in the eye. "That depends," Phillips replied. "Do you think you need one?" "No," I said firmly. "I have nothing to hide." Phillips gestured toward an interview room. "This way." I followed her inside, while Devin headed elsewhere. She motioned for me to sit, then pressed a button on the recorder. Detective Desiree Phillips interviewing Mr. Roger Rigby in connection with case 1256G, involving Lauren Tanya Rigby. "Mr. Rigby, please state your name, age, and date of birth." "Roger Ezekiel Rigby. I'm Chagiste Pionte. Born December 16th. Your address and occupation?" 1467 West Danu Avenue, Colorado Springs. "I'm a bricklayer." Phillips leaned forward slightly. "Where were you between 6 p.m. last night and 8 a.m. this morning?" I answered without hesitation. "Working on a fireplace in Manitou Springs from 9 to 7. Then I drove to Jerry's Bar and stayed there until 11. I was home by 11:30 and stayed there until your call." "Anyone who can confirm that?" "Blanche Donovan in Manitou can vouch for my work. Greg Hannibal saw me at Jerry's, and my neighbor, Stephen Harper, saw me at home around midnight, 3 and 6. "Why so many times?" Devin asked, rejoining us. "We both have dogs, and they need to be walked at those times. Stephen's a night owl. We cross paths regularly." The detectives exchanged glances. Phillips pressed on. When did you last see your wife? Monday morning. I drove her to the airport for her flight to Houston. What was she doing there? It was her company's annual meeting for top performers. This was her third year. What does your wife do? Devin asked. She sells life insurance for TransUnited. You know, those ads with the old man telling you to prepare for the inevitable. Both detectives nodded. When did you last see her carrying her suitcase? Phillips asked. At the airport. I dropped her off and went to work. Did you two have breakfast together? No. We were going to, but she forgot her bag, so we had to go back home to get it. She forgot her luggage? Phillips raised an eyebrow. She thought I grabbed it when I warmed up the car. I didn't notice it was still on the bed until we were almost at the airport. Phillips nodded thoughtfully. How often does she go on business trips? Twice a year. February for the general meeting and August for training in Indianapolis. And the general meeting is always in Houston? No. Last year, it was in Los Angeles. The year before, New York. After conferring with Devin, Phillips asked, do you know anyone who might want to harm your wife? Not that I know of. Maybe a disgruntled client. Why would a client want to harm her? Her company's sales tactics aren't exactly upfront. They offer a free kids info kit, then use it to sell life insurance. Some people aren't happy when she shows up. Did she have any appointments in Vail? No idea. She was supposed to be in Houston. Phillips folded her hands. Do you think she might have been with someone else in Vail? I took a breath. I don't know. You should talk to her colleagues in Houston. They might know why she wasn't there. Devin sighed, while Phillips seemed satisfied for now. You can go, Mr. Rigby. Are you heading home tonight? No. I'll find a motel. As I left the station and drove back to the hospital, my mind churned. Lauren was playing a dangerous game. Less than a week ago, I dropped her at the airport, and now she was lying in a hospital bed in Vail. None of it made sense. At the hospital, I was informed visiting hours were over, and I could return at 7 in the morning. I asked the guard for hotel recommendations, and he chuckled. In Vail, during ski season? Cheap means staying with family. I forced a polite laugh and walked to my car. As I sat there, I remembered Lauren's belongings. Among them was a missing prescription bottle of Percocet, left over from a dental procedure months ago. Why was she still carrying those pills? Then I noticed her boots. Lauren always took them on trips, and she used to stash key cards inside. I checked, and sure enough, there was one, but it was blank, no logos or identifiers. Now I had a key, but no idea where it led. I met Detective Phillips at the police station as planned. She greeted me with professional politeness and led me to her office. Without a word, I handed her the blank key card I'd found in Lauren's boot. You look like a man whose world is falling apart, she said, watching me closely. I held her gaze, unflinching. Let's just say I'm prepared for the worst. I'll hear her side of things, but at this point, I doubt I'll believe it. Don't lose hope yet, she replied, though the doubt in her eyes betrayed her words. I gave a curt nod and left, heading straight to the hospital. Visiting hours were limited to 15 minutes every 2 hours, which didn't leave much time for answers. During one visit, I stood by her bed, watching her battered face, waiting for her to wake up and explain herself. While I was there, Dr. Benson approached. Mr. Rigby, your wife's recovery is going well, but given the severity of her injuries, we recommend transferring her to Denver for specialized rehabilitation. I barely heard him. My focus was on her injuries and the tangled mess of lies that had brought us here. He mentioned possible brain damage, but I was more concerned with the truth. Can the transfer be handled at St. Luke's? It's on my way home, I asked. Dr. Benson frowned. Where's home for you? Colorado Springs. He made a call, returning a few minutes later. The plan has changed. We'll transfer her to St. Augustine's in Colorado Springs. It's just as good and closer for your family. I signed the new paperwork, visited Lauren one last time, and left the hospital. Tears burned my eyes briefly, but I quickly shut them down. Emotions wouldn't solve this. On the way out of Vail, I called Jim, her father, to give him an update. When I arrived home, my sister Beth's Jeep was parked in the driveway. Seeing her felt like a relief I hadn't known I needed. Piper, my Doberman, greeted me at the door with unbridled excitement, while Beth waited inside. One look at me, and she knew something was wrong. I hugged her briefly, then sat down and told her everything. No sugarcoating, no holding back. Beth stayed with me late into the night, urging me to eat, though I had no appetite. She insisted on coming with me when I decided to tell Jim and Ian everything in person. As I explained the situation to them, I watched Jim's confidence in his daughter waver. It was a look I'd seen before, a look that signaled deep uncertainty. I remembered another moment like this. Lauren and I had been dating for several months when she suddenly canceled our weekend plans. Annoyed but understanding, I let it go until I overheard Jim shouting, "Tell that son of a witch he'd better meet me." Worried, I drove to their house. Jim met me at the door, his face flushed with anger. "You're no better than the last prick. If you're going to hurt my daughter, take it out on me," he yelled. Shocked, I replied, "Hurt her? What are you talking about?" Lauren appeared then, a black eye on full display. "What happened?" I demanded, my voice sharp. "She didn't tell you?" Jim barked. "You struck her." Lauren quickly stepped in. "No, duh. He didn't touch me. I had dinner with Garrett, and we argued. He hit me. I left." Jim looked embarrassed, but I was already livid. "We're done," I told her flatly and walked away. My car seemed to steer itself as I drove aimlessly, eventually finding myself outside Garrett's trailer. I knocked, and when he opened the door with a smug grin, I didn't hesitate. My fist connected with his jaw, and I didn't stop until he was on the ground. Moving boxes were scattered in the trailer, and I kicked one toward him. "Leaving town?" I asked. When he groaned in response, I gave him one last shove. "Good." Back home, icing my knuckles, the phone rang. Without checking the ID, I answered. "Roger, please," Lauren's voice pleaded before I hung up. She called again, and this time I let it ring. When the phone rang for the third time, I checked the ID, her name again. I ignored it. Minutes later, my cousin Hugh called. "Zeke," he said, using my middle name. "CSPD got a call about Garrett Jimenez being in rough shape. He claims some big guy roughed him up. Know anything about that?" I chuckled. "Nope, nothing at all. Thanks for the heads up. Be careful, Zeke. If this ties back to you, it could get messy." Not long after, the police arrived at my door. I was ready. My hockey gear was laid out, and the scratches on my knuckles had a perfectly reasonable explanation. The officer eyed the scratches on my knuckles, and I calmly explained, "Rough game during hockey practice. You know how it gets." Since I played on a team sponsored by the police department, he didn't press further. That Saturday, I hit the ice with intensity, preparing for the upcoming season. Hockey helped clear my mind, though it didn't erase the mounting questions about Lauren. When I returned home, I found several notes pinned to my door. Most were from her, but one caught my attention. It was from Jim, apologizing for jumping to conclusions. I called him back. "Jim, it's fine," I said curtly. "You reacted the way any father would. The real issue is Lauren, not you." "Thanks, son," he said hesitantly. "Do you want to talk to her? She's been asking for you." In the background, I heard her pleading voice. I cut through it. "No, Jim. She let you believe I was the one who hit her when she knew exactly what Garrett was capable of. That's not something I can overlook." Jim sighed, disappointment clear in his voice. "I understand, but I'm still sorry for how this turned out." "It's not your fault," I replied firmly. "But I don't have time for cheating women." Back in the present, as I finished recounting this to Jim and Ian, I saw Jim reliving that memory. He finally spoke. "I'm glad she's here, son, but I hope you're not planning anything drastic." "Don't worry, sir," I replied. "No lawyers yet, but Lauren has a lot to answer for." "Whatever happens, Roger, you'll always be family to us," Ian added gently. "I appreciate that," I said, meaning it. "And I won't cut you out of my life." On the drive home, Beth broke the silence. "Will you be okay? Do I have a choice?" I replied evenly. "I'm not the type to curl up and die." She nodded, hesitating before asking, "If she cheated, is there any chance you'd stay together?" "None," I said flatly. "I'm not going to be one of those paranoid husbands, constantly tracking her every move." Beth sighed. "Mom asked about you. She loves you, you know. Maybe you should talk to her." I shook my head. "So, she can tell me cheating is normal?" "No thanks." Beth didn't push further but added softly, I just don't want you to make a decision you'll regret. Don't worry, I replied, my voice steady. I'll get all the answers first. After Beth dropped me off, I headed to Stephen and Joe's place. I handed Stephen Lauren's laptop, explaining the situation while he got to work digging through it. Joe, trying to lighten the mood, joked, "Need me to set you up with my cousin? She's single." I smirked. "Unless she's got C cups and is shaved. Never mind." Joe laughed. "Prude," he teased, grinning. He headed upstairs for bed, joking about dreaming of our newly single neighbor. I chuckled. Mrs. Jasper had been a widow forever, but Joe's humor was what I needed. While Stephen worked on the laptop, I played a quick game of tag with Piper in the yard. The cold cut our fun short, so I headed back inside and collapsed into bed. Piper jumped up beside me, and this time I didn't care. Lauren had always hated Piper on the bed, but her opinions didn't matter anymore. Despite the physical exhaustion, sleep didn't come easy. By morning, I was up early, scanning the sports section with a coffee in hand until the clock hit 8 a.m. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in the office of Bernie Jaggs, Lauren's boss. Bernie greeted me with his usual cheer. "What can I do for you, Brian?" He always got my name wrong. Ignoring it, I cut to the chase. "Can you tell me why Lauren would leave the Houston convention and end up in Vail?" His smile faltered. "Vale, I didn't send her to Houston. That meeting was for newer agents, not managers like Lauren." I clenched my jaw. "What about the training sessions in Indianapolis? 2 weeks at a time, right?" Bernie shifted uncomfortably. "Those are only a few days long. We leave Sunday and return Thursday." It all clicked. Has she been taking extra time off and staying somewhere else? Bernie sighed. "Roger, sometimes people make choices that are hard to understand. I'm sorry if this news hurts." Anger flared. "Who was she with?" He hesitated. "Promise me no one gets hurt." I stared at him coldly. "My wife is in a coma. I won't hurt anyone. Now give me a name." Bernie sighed heavily and finally spoke. My heart sank. That little weasel. Later that evening, my cousin Hugh called. "How are you holding up, Zeke?" he asked. Hugh was one of the few who still used my middle name. "I'm Monadin." "What's up?" We identified who rented the room where Lauren was staying. "We're bringing him in for questioning. If he refuses, we'll arrest him." "Can I be there when you question him?" I asked without hesitation. Hugh paused. "Jeb's already approved it. I'll call you when we have it set up." I spent the next few hours at the hospital, meeting with Lauren's brain injury team. Part of me wanted to wash my hands of the entire situation, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I still didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. Jim and Ian arrived about an hour before Lauren's transfer from Vail. I told them what I'd learned, laying out the facts without emotion. Jim looked visibly shaken, and Ian begged me not to make any final decisions yet. "I won't do anything drastic," I assured her. "But I'm not sure waiting is the right move, either." Jim asked, "Do you think you can get through this?" I answered honestly, "I don't know. I can't trust her anymore, and that's not something I'm willing to live with." Ian, trying to remain hopeful, said, "But you've forgiven her before." I shook my head. That was different. We weren't married then, and she wasn't lying to my face like this. I thought back to the aftermath of the Garrett incident years ago. After weeks of avoiding her calls, I realized we'd never officially declared our relationship exclusive. She was still seeing Garrett, but that wasn't what infuriated me. It was her willingness to let her father believe I'd hurt her. One evening, after hockey practice, I found Lauren sitting outside my apartment door. "You didn't answer my call, so here I am," she said. I crossed my arms. "Do you have to be such a pain, Lauren? I didn't miss you." "Oh, really?" she shot back. "Maybe you missed me while your boyfriend was still in bed." Her face fell. "You're mad about Garrett?" "No," I said coldly. "I'm mad you let your dad think I hit you. That's what disgusts me." I walked past her into the apartment, and she followed. "We never agreed to be exclusive, so I can't be mad about you sleeping with him. But I can be mad at myself for not seeing through you sooner." She started to cry. "Are you finished?" "Oh, I'm done. What I don't get is why you're still here." "Because I need you to listen," she pleaded. "I'm sorry I let my dad think you hurt me. I canceled our date, so you wouldn't do something stupid. I left my phone at home when I went to see Garrett, and when I refused to move to Wyoming with him, he hit me. I ran to Julie's, then went home to call you, but my dad saw me first." I stood there, staring at her, unsure what to believe. Finally, I said, I listened. Now I'm taking a shower. I don't know why, but I asked, want to join me? She didn't hesitate. That night, we decided to be exclusive, and 3 weeks later, she moved in. 8 months after that, we were married. The only time Garrett came up again was when she told me he died in a car accident in Wyoming. She even went to his funeral. Now, all these years later, I was standing in a hospital, signing papers to transfer her to St. Augustine's ICU. The doctors were optimistic about her recovery, but my faith in her was anything but. As I waited at the hospital, Hugh texted me, Cal Davis will be interviewed at 4 a.m. I told Jim and I had an appointment and left. Back home, I put on a suit and tie. Sheriff Jeb Hannibal had a way of expecting professionalism, and I wasn't about to give anyone an excuse to look down on me. When I arrived at the sheriff's office, Hugh greeted me. The Vale police will join by video, he explained. You'll sit out of view. And remember, don't speak. It could jeopardize the case. I know the drill. I'm not going to lose my temper. As we walked into the building, I spotted Catherine Shepard, the girl I'd once thought was out of my league back in high school. She still looked stunning. Hugh noticed my glance and teased. Stop drooling, Zeke. Inside, Sheriff Jeb grinned and said, I've always wanted to do this. He pulled out a badge and deputized me on the spot, so I could legally remain in the room. Your dad was a great cop, and I know you will be too if you ever finish that degree. I nodded, trying to focus on the task at hand, but my thoughts drifted briefly. Even Catherine Shepard, with her perfect smile, might have ended up cheating. It seemed no one could be trusted anymore. In my family, trust always seemed like a fragile thing, easily broken and hard to rebuild. Maybe that was just how it was for us. I figured even Daniel would agree. Hugh and I entered the interrogation room. He pointed to a chair tucked out of the camera's view. Sit there, he said, setting up the video conference. Soon, Detective Phillips and another officer joined via speaker. A deputy brought in a slick-looking man, Cal Davis. He walked in with a confident stride, his perpetual salesman's smile plastered across his face. Even surrounded by law enforcement, he seemed at ease. I didn't know him personally, but I knew of him. He was Lauren's mentor. Mr. Davis, Hugh began, this interview is being recorded. No problem, Cal replied, still grinning like he was about to pitch a timeshare. Hugh introduced the team, including Detective Phillips and Detective Albert from Vale. He then asked Cal if he understood his rights and was willing to speak without a lawyer. Cal nodded, leaning back in his chair as if he had nothing to hide. The routine questions started. Where he'd been, who could verify his whereabouts. And it became clear pretty quickly that Cal wasn't the one who'd hurt Lauren. But as the questions got more specific, cracks began to show. Mr. Davis, where were you from Friday through Sunday? Phillips asked. I was in Houston for a work meeting, Cal replied smoothly. Spent the weekend with my wife. We'll confirm that with your boss, Hugh said. Cal's confidence wavered. His tan complexion paled, and he shifted uncomfortably. Can I tell you something off the record? He asked, his voice quieter now. This is all on the record, Mr. Davis, Phillips said firmly. With a defeated sigh, Cal confessed to a 6-year affair with Lauren. The revelation didn't shock me. I'd suspected as much, but hearing him admit it so casually turned my stomach. He looked genuinely shaken when he learned she was in the hospital. We drove to Denver on Friday, he explained. She told me she'd won a trip to Vale. I dropped her at the airport and went home. My wife can confirm it. Hugh pressed on with a few more questions before finally dismissing Cal with a warning not to leave town. As he stood to leave, Cal asked for a private word with me. Once alone, his slick demeanor was gone, replaced by something pathetic. Roger, he said, his voice cracking, you know who I am, right? Obviously, I replied coolly. And you clearly know me too. He nodded. Lauren keeps your photo on her desk, in her presentation kit. She loves you, you know. I laughed bitterly. No, she doesn't. If she did, we wouldn't be here. I love her too, Cal said, his voice almost pleading. And my wife, she knows how I feel about Lauren. It started when I interviewed her for my team. We had chemistry. One day, after a no-show presentation, we went for lunch near a military base. Afterward, we made love at a nearby hotel. I cut him off. You're telling me this as if I care. You're a coward who couldn't keep his pants zipped. Spare me the romance. It wasn't just about sex, he insisted. It was real. Real, I said with a mocking smile. Your wife must feel so lucky to be part of this fairy tale. Kausiga Habili. I'm sorry you're angry. You're sorry I'm angry? I snapped. What I can't understand is how you thought this was okay. Did you really think this wouldn't blow up in your face? For the first time, Cal looked genuinely broken. It wasn't just a fling, Roger. It was something meaningful. But you can have her now. Have her? I laughed coldly. You're delusional if you think I'm sharing my wife with anyone. If I'd known, I would have ended this long ago. And let me give you a heads up, I don't tolerate cheating. Cal's face crumpled. I don't regret loving her. But did she cheat on me too? His voice cracked as tears welled in his eyes. I didn't answer. Will you? No. She's at St. Augustine's, room 2410. Tell her dad I'll be in touch. As I turned to leave, he called out, You're not going to tell my wife, are you? I glanced back, my face expressionless. Why would I hurt her? The guilt will eat you alive. Have fun living with that. In the hallway, he was waiting for me. Sorry, Zeke, he said. I thought we had the guy. He's not the one who hurt her, I replied. But how did I miss this for so long? Just then, a commotion erupted behind us. Cal's wife, Katrina Shepard, stormed out of the interrogation room, fury blazing in her eyes. You cheating prick, she shouted, slapping him hard across the face. Don't come home. As she passed me, she broke into tears and hugged me tightly. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I patted her back stiffly. It's not your fault. We just married the wrong people. Cheaters, I muttered as Katrina pulled away, laughing softly through her tears. I wiped one away with a curt nod. I hope things turn out okay for you. Good luck to you too, Roger, she said, kissing me lightly on the cheek before walking away. I turned to Hugh. He had her at home, but he still needed Lauren. Some men just don't know when they have enough. Some guys just want what they can't have, he replied as we headed to Jeb's office. I handed back the badge, and, as expected, Jeb launched into his usual speech about how I'd make a great cop if I ever decided to finish my degree. I'd heard it all before, but maybe one day I'd listen. The following days were a whirlwind. On Tuesday, I focused on finding a lawyer to protect myself in the inevitable divorce. Thankfully, Lauren and I didn't have children, and Piper was unquestionably mine. The house wasn't an issue, either. Her grandmother owned it. My brother and I had inherited my father's house, so I wouldn't need to move into a dingy apartment. Lauren had fought me on keeping the house after Daniel's arrest, but I knew then it was worth the fight, and I was even more certain of it now. Late Tuesday evening, I visited the hospital. Jim was already there. He shook his head as I approached. How long? He asked. 6 years. At least since she started selling insurance, I replied. But there could be more. Jim looked devastated. I can't believe my daughter did this. Me neither. I wouldn't have married her if I'd known. I told him everything Cal had confessed. Jim sighed heavily. I always wondered why she stopped taking photos on her trips. She used to snap pictures everywhere, even in Denver. Why didn't I see the signs? I didn't either, I admitted. I won't be coming back to the hospital, Jim. I can't see her again. Jim nodded solemnly. I understand. Will you stay at the house until she recovers? I'll stay, I agreed, but I won't file for divorce until she's better. I realized I'd missed Jim and Ian. They treated me like family. None of this was their fault, even if Lauren's betrayal had hurt us both deeply. Wednesday was grueling. I spent the day repairing a chimney before heading to a hockey game in the evening. I played hard, too hard, spending much of the first period in the penalty box. By the second period, after another unnecessary penalty, my coach pulled me from the game. He was a friend of Paul's and understood I was dealing with personal issues, but he didn't want me kicked out of the league. When I got home, I was still fuming over the loss, blaming myself for letting my personal life bleed into the game. My teammates had tried to cheer me up, even offering to take care of Cal, though I might not have refused their offers strongly enough. After letting Piper out, I was about to head back inside when Steven called, saying he was coming over. I figured he'd found something on Lauren's laptop. The night before, I'd gone through our bills and statements, but found nothing suspicious, except for an unusual pattern. Lauren had been calling her friend Fiona more often before her trips. I suspected Fiona knew more than I did, but I hadn't been able to reach her. Stephen arrived, looking excited. "What did you find?" I asked. "Grab a beer," he said with a grin. "You're going to want to sit down for this." We sat at the bar as he opened Lauren's laptop. "Whoever erased the data knew what they were doing," he explained. "There are programs here that let her browse without leaving a trace. Luckily, I had help from someone in the Department of Defense." "Is Lauren secretly a hacker?" I asked, half joking. "No, está bien displayed. She uses the same password for everything. Someone else set this up. My guess? Fiona." Stephen showed me hidden emails and bank accounts Lauren had been using. He found love notes addressed to both Cal and someone named Garrett. My jaw tightened as I muttered, "Son of a witch." Stephen walked me through how to access one of the hidden accounts, which had over $10,000 in it. I arranged for the funds to be transferred to our joint account and closed the hidden account. I also updated the contact information to ensure I'd be notified of any activity. Later, I called Detective Phillips despite the late hour and told her about the account and a missing debit card from Lauren's belongings. She thanked me and said, "You should consider becoming a cop." "I hear that a lot," I replied dryly. The next morning, Jim called to say the doctors expected Lauren to wake up soon. "Have you thought about forgiving her?" he asked. "No," I said simply, explaining that I kept uncovering more lies. I told him about Lauren's affair with Garrett, but left out the hidden bank account. Jim sounded heartbroken. Stephen arrived later with more news. "You won't believe this," he said. He explained that Lauren hadn't lied entirely about going to Garrett's funeral. She had gone to Laramie for Fiona's funeral. Garrett's sister. That's likely when their affair reignited. It got worse. The year Lauren called me to meet her in Miami, Garrett had been in jail for petty theft. His parole prohibited him from leaving Colorado, which explained why their trips had become more local. I called my lawyer to share my findings, and he assured me it could all be handled legally. Now, I just had to wait for Lauren to wake up. 2 weeks later, she came out of her coma and was questioned by detectives. I stayed out of sight, but listened as Phillips and Albert handled the interrogation. When Phillips asked why she had the Jiminy Cricket tattoo, Lauren revealed it was Garrett's idea, a way for him to always be with me without Roger knowing. That's when I stepped into the room. "No need to explain further," I said, handing her divorce papers. "You've already been served." Her screams echoed as I walked out the door, finally free.